heating systems. I'll kick us off. I'm Katrina Manigan. I'm the Director of Buildings and Homes for Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. I'd like to do a quick round of introductions, and then I'll take just a minute to frame what I think is sort of the challenge for our group today. I might see if our colleagues in CPD want to add anything to that, and then I'll bring it over to Sean Dennison, our consultant working on developing these code proposals, to sort of walk through just some of the substance to center the conversation. Our real goal for today is to start to identify what some of the issues are that we hope to work through as a group. And I'll frame that in a little more detail, but let's do introductions first. I know we have a pretty big group, so I'll run through them pretty quickly. Let's go through city staff first. And let's start with the rest of the climate office team. So Courtney, do you want to say hi?
Sure, thanks Katrina. And hi everyone, I'm Courtney Anderson with the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resiliency. I focus on net zero energy, and I'm really been involved in the code process this year with many of you, as well as our partners in CPD.
And Tom?
Tom Gleason, Green Building Outreach Administrator. I am just here to listen in and take notes.
All right, let's go through the CPD staff. Eric?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Eric Browning, Chief Building Official in CPD.
Thanks. Chuck?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chuck Bartell. I'm the Mechanical Plumbing Plan Review Engineering Supervisor.
Thank you. And Danny? Let me find my list of
Good afternoon, Danny Blancich, Mechanical Plumbing Plan Review Engineer.
Thank you. Did I miss any other CPD staff as I'm scrolling through the list again? I think so. All right, let's have Sean. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Sean Dennison. I'm a Senior Project Manager with New Buildings Institute. We've been the technical advisor to the city through most of this process, and I'm dealing with a bit of a cold today, so I apologize for any roughness in my voice or roughness in my thinking.
Thanks, Sean. And let's go through all the stakeholders who are part of this. First, let's start with Christine Brinker, since she is the proponent for these code proposals that's been working with Sean to develop them. Christine?
Hi, everyone. Christine Brinker with Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. And my apology is that I'm in a coffee shop today, so I'm sorry about any background noise.
Hey, you broke up a little bit, which I think is what you apologized for, but I think we caught who you are. So
coffee shop. My internet. I'm in a coffee shop. Sorry.
No problem. Okay, I'll run through my list, which I think is alphabetical. So Darren, will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Darren Ramirez with RJA. I'm a mechanical engineer and principal here. We're just happy to help.
Thank you for being here. Elizabeth?
Yeah, hey everybody, it's Elizabeth Gilmore with Energetics. We do energy modeling and consulting.
Thanks. Mark Jelinski?
Hi, Mark Jelinski. I'm mechanical engineer, chief mechanical engineer at RMH Group, and I've served on several other code committees for the city and county of Denver over the past several cycles, and I'm currently on the plumbing, mechanical, fuel gas as well.
Thanks, Mark. Libby?
Yeah, I'm Libby Coleman with Group 14 Engineering. I believe Taylor Roberts will typically be on these calls, but I'm a project manager of Group 14 on our energy team, and we do energy modeling and energy efficiency consulting.
Thank you. I have a Mark S.
Yeah, hi, I am Mark Snyder with 4240 Architecture, local architect, and happy just to contribute in any way I can.
Thank you so much for being here. And Mike Reynolds?
Mike Reynolds, Nava Real Estate, owner's rep. I've been working in the multifamily residential industry for the last 8 years or so, and happy to be a part of the group.
Thank you. And Teresa?
Sorry, I was on mute. Teresa Gray with Ramirez Johnson Associates. I work with Darren. I'm an electrical engineer.
Great. Okay, did I miss anyone?
Did you get Christy?
Don't think she's here. Did she pop up at the top of my list?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm just calling in and I'll be listening. I'm traveling, so I probably won't be saying much, but I'm listening.
Thank you so much, Christy. Did I miss anyone else?
Yes, I'm Eric Johnson. I'm up in Boulder. I've been a construction project manager for many years. I'm working as owner's representative, mostly with the Boulder Housing Partners, Boulder Housing Authority.
Thank you so much, Eric, for being here. Apologies for missing you. Did I miss anyone else in the long list? Okay. So thank you all. First, just a process overview. This working group is going to meet 4 times in May and June. You should have those on your calendar. The goal is to take the commercial space and water heating electrification proposals that were brought forward by SWEEP and NBI and refine and think through those. They will then go back to the full code committee for a vote. So this group is just going to workshop the proposals a little bit. I'm here just to facilitate. I don't pretend to be the kind of subject matter expert that all of you are, so do feel free to redirect me if I get something wrong. But I just want to run a really good process over the next 8 weeks to refine these proposals. I will just start by stating what I think is sort of the challenge before this group, and then pass it to Sean to sort of walk through each of the proposals. So I think the heart of the challenge that has been posed to the code committees and therefore to this group is that the Energize Denver ordinance requires existing buildings to begin electrifying upon system replacement and when cost effective space and water heating equipment starting in 2025. And this code update that Denver will adopt this year will result in buildings that are still being built in that same time frame of 2025. And I can share kind of a timeline and walk through that in a bit more detail. And so we've really been challenged by our community that wants us to solve climate change, and by city councils, or when we brought them Energize Denver, to make sure new buildings are leading by example. And so I think at a minimum, we've been challenged to make sure new buildings are leading in the way that and doing at least as well as, if not better than, existing buildings in terms of climate solutions. And I'll just, for those, because I don't think everyone, I know for some this is very redundant, but not everyone in this group I think has necessarily heard kind of what is Energize Denver. So I'll very briefly summarize that and what that kind of challenge is before us today. So the Energize Denver ordinance has performance requirements for existing buildings, but then also these renewable heating and cooling requirements for existing buildings. And that starts with easy to electrify systems. Those are the warm air furnaces, both sort of indoor and rooftop units, and the individual systems with the tank water heaters. Those requirements will start in 2025, again, upon system replacement, where existing buildings will have to electrify. And then harder to electrify systems like the PTAX and hydronic systems start in 2027. Central hot water systems, those all start in 2027, again, upon system replacement when cost effective. So I just want to show a timeline for how the code that we adopt now will overlap with these requirements. So starting on the left, we're currently under the 2019 Denver Building Code that runs through, buildings will keep getting a certificate of occupancy under that code for another couple of years, because they may get permitted this year and still built for a couple more years. Similarly, this 2022 Denver Building Code that we're writing right now will result in new buildings that are opening up for business through 2026 or 2027. Even if we adopt a new code in 2025, buildings that have been permitted will keep getting built, will keep coming out of the ground and going into operation beyond that. And so you can see then in green how the Energize Denver performance requirements, the first targets for those are really in 2024. So that will overlap with this code. And then more of interest to this group, the electrification requirements start in 2025, and those will also, those requirements for existing buildings to partially electrify some space and water heating systems upon replacement when cost effective start in 2025 and sort of very directly overlap with this code. And so we want to refine and work on what makes sense to include in code around requirements for electrification of commercial space and water heating systems. And so thank you all for engaging in helping us figure out how to do that. Anything, Eric, that you'd like to add, or others from CPD, just in terms of the challenge before us over the next 8 weeks? 4 meetings.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Katrina. Just to reiterate, the parity, with the existing buildings ordinance is so crucial, and the city very much intends to attempt the partial electrification criteria for new construction, to be in line from a timing perspective as well, as Katrina had mentioned. So I won't repeat everything she said, but these are two very important proposals that have some great support, throughout the city as well. And our prerogative is simply to make sure that the language, the ability to design and build and enforce and perform to these regulations is achievable. That's the idea. So thanks, Katrina. Go ahead.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, so I want to pass things to Sean to walk through the proposals as they were brought before the committee, but also as he walks through that, is going to highlight places where based on what the code committee already discussed, or a smaller working group we ran discussed, where there were obvious changes or points that will need further work. I want this group to be able to build on the work of the code committee. So he will walk through what some of those were, and then we'll turn to the discussion to sort of identify and further flesh out what are the questions that this group needs to solve together over our 4 meetings. But Sean, I'll let you take it away to just walk through the space heating and water heating proposals.
So we'll start with just a little bit of context. The electrification of space and water heating proposals were identified as one of the big impact proposals being considered in this code cycle. So in this chart, you can see, I think some of you are very familiar, but some of you may not be familiar at all. This tracks the progress of various model codes and the Denver Energy Code in terms of greenhouse gas emissions toward the goal set in the Denver Implementation Plan. And if you look at the 2022 year for the code cycle that we are considering, there are, I can't really highlight them for you very independently, but you can see kind of the max potential of all of the proposals submitted, and the line, the dot above it is the where we would get just from what has already been adopted, which is just a couple of minor proposals, plus the heat pump proposals that we are talking about today. This orange dot from 2021, that is the base code from which we are working. So that kind of gives you an idea of where Denver would be without any Denver amendments. It would be a little bit lower than that because it would benefit from grid decarbonization, but that's pretty close to what our starting point is. So we can see that the impact of these 2 proposals, if they went through with kind of full electrification, would be fairly substantial. But like Katrina said, during the course of conversations, the challenges of doing that became an issue. So that is what we'll be discussing. And we can start going, well, actually first, are there any questions about that general context? All right. So we will start with the space heating. proposal that was submitted by Sweep. And let me find the right one. So this is the last version that the committee looked at. And what it provides, what it requires is that essentially heat pump space heating would be required for all, heat pumps would be required to provide all of the space heating. It provides exceptions for kind of low energy buildings, I mean, very low energy buildings, spot heating. It provides for just a little bit of, for some technical considerations. So like when you have a makeup air system that is prohibited from using energy recovery ventilation. So, you know, you would have to use a heat pump. There are issues with using heat pumps for makeup air. So uh, there's an exception for that. There's a somewhat, there's an exception for what is essentially large equipment, but it's based on cooling capacity. So I mean, there's some issues with that there. And then supplementary heat, which is something that's exceptions for supplementary heat, which is something that's already in the code. And so you can see in the second section, there is modifications made to the existing supplementary heat requirements that expand it beyond just electric resistance. And this essentially is a set of control requirements that when you have supplementary heat with heat pumps, it has to be controlled in such a way that it's not being used, you know, unless these certain things happen. One of the first three are existing in the code right now. The fourth one was added as an air temperature, and it's already been highlighted that if a threshold like this is in place, it probably needs to be raised to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is really pushing for, you know, most small systems to be to go to, and actually 20 tons, that's not really small, it's smallish, systems to move to heat pump water heaters. This does not fully align with what is in the Electrify Denver ordinance. And so if we wanted to do that, then this language would need to be fairly substantially modified. And we actually have a mock-up of what that might look like, but it's just a very draft, but we can switch over to that if our conversation wants to go that direction. So are there any questions about this?
I'm going to jump in here. This is Eric. Not a question, but just a clarification for everyone participating today. A reminder that we are referring to commercial partial electrification for space and water heating, and commercial excludes single family duplex or IRC townhome type design. So we just want to be extremely clear that we're talking about commercial and multifamily buildings.
And thank you, Eric, for that. Sean, do you mind zooming in a little bit? It's a little fun out. Maybe others are having that problem too. Thank you.
So this is, I mean, it's for reference. I think it's already been identified that there are technical issues with this proposal, even if it were to go through conceptually, that would need to be addressed. Even if we, you know, so if this were to move forward, those technical issues would need to be addressed for it to be workable in code for Denver. Do we want to switch over and look at what something that's fully aligned with electrification, Electrified Denver would look like?
I don't know that I would be tempted to introduce the water heat proposal.
Sure.
Also, since those were the two that were sent in advance.
All right, so let me switch over. All right. Now I just need to find it on my screen. There we go. And we will make that one a little bit bigger. So this proposal is very similar in intent, except for it applies to to water heating rather than space heating. And it states that service hot water has to be provided by an electric heat pump, and that heat pump has to be sized to provide 100% of the peak hot water demand. It also has some requirements around when it's in unconditioned space versus conditioned space. We have a similar set of exceptions. It's got an exception for electric resistance that's integrated into the equipment because that is very common. It has exceptions for what you might call pony water heaters or low boy, these 20-gallon water heaters that might be used just say for a lavatory or for a kitchenette or boost heating. That there really isn't a heat pump equipment option for these small water heaters, and the efficiency gains because the usage is so low is not as large anyway. Again, we have supplementary water heating systems. We have an exception for water heating systems that serve high temperature outputs. And so this could be in, say, a restaurant setting, or it could be in a healthcare setting. We are beginning to see 180-degree heat pump water heaters, but they are just now emerging on the market. So they're not as kind of widespread in the market as your typical, more 120, 140-degree output range water heaters are. Provides exceptions for heat trace freeze protection. Snow and ice melt, probably not necessary, but it's there for clarity. And then this last item, the other water heating systems as approved, was included as a catch-all. But one of the comments that we've received is that it probably needs to be eliminated. And then it creates a supplementary heat control requirement section that is similar to what is already in the code that we modify on the space heating side, with a similar set of criteria. So when the heat pump is located in an unconditioned space, the supplementary heat can come on when the temperature is below 20 degrees. Whether that should maybe be 40 degrees, I think, is an open question for this. When the heat pump is operating in defrost mode, and if the vapor compression cycle malfunctions or loses power. There is an exception for this. So sometimes heat trace is used for temperature maintenance on a loop, and that can be an effective and actually can even be an efficient way to do it. So it is clear that those are exempted from all of this as long as the capacity of the heat trace system isn't bigger than your regular system. Just like the other one, the committee already identified there are some technical issues with this proposal that would need to be resolved, even if it were to go through conceptually as is. And then I'll note, because this one is a little bit different, for the relationship to Electrify Denver, that one is based on only in 2024 is based on storage and instantaneous water heaters. So central boilers, which this would apply to, the Electrify Denver ordinance does not apply to.
Thank you, Sean. So I think there's two things that I'm hearing, and I'd love to hear from the rest of the group, like two big buckets of work. First is conceptually, do we want, and maybe we take them one at a time, these proposals, do we want to work on these proposals as a group in terms of the way they're currently drafted, which is electrifying all space heat and electrifying all water heat? Or do we want to align them with Energize Denver and work towards making sure that for new buildings, it's those furnaces and individual water heater systems with a tank that are electrified and not moved to some of the new buildings? So there's the kind of big concept question, and then there's a lot of little technical details that we're going to need to get right. Does that sound like the right framework for this group? Seeing some heads nod, which I think is good. Sean, I don't know if you want to stop sharing, because I think I'd love to hear a little bit. Like, I want to make sure that we kind of vet and list issues that need to be worked through today. But I think that my instinct is that the detailed issues depend on which of the big paths we choose. The first question: do we try to continue to work on these proposals around electrification of all systems, or do we limit to the same similar systems as Energize Denver? And then the details that flow from that might be different. Does that sound right to everyone else? The details that flow from that will be different depending on that first decision. So we may want to have some discussion on the first decision before we spend a lot of time identifying all the details that have to be resolved.
And I'll offer one more bit of context. So Washington State just approved their new commercial energy code, and it includes similar provisions for using heat pumps for space and water heating. And keep in mind that Washington is not just Seattle, it's also Eastern Washington, which is, while not the same climate as Denver, I think is more similar than some other climates. The big, theirs is fairly complex because it's really trying to get at electrification and not just heat pumps. The one thing, if you have been following Washington, the one difference from what was happening earlier is that they're only requiring it for 50% of the service water heating load. So for individual water heaters, that's probably going to end up being 100% anyway, because that's the easiest way to do it. But for central systems, that would pretty much force them into either all heat pump or a hybrid system that is partially heat pump. And then the other consideration for Washington is that it is the home of some of the mechanical engineering shops that are leading the way in heat pump design. So their market is a little bit different than Denver's in the availability of expertise. Washington is probably the only other jurisdiction, I think, that has considered outside of California, which has electrification reach codes where they're requiring all electric buildings in several jurisdictions across the state. But I think that Washington is probably the only other jurisdiction that's more like Denver that has gone this direction so far.
Thanks, Sean. And I might just add on that one thing, we're on the product availability question. One thing we've heard from contractors is that sometimes they actually have to buy heat pumps in Seattle because there's lots of them available there because this is already part of Seattle's code. And so we'd just say we've heard concerns about product availability. When something actually becomes code, we're hearing stories from Washington that problem becomes much better because suppliers supply where things are code. But let's turn back to the question. I'd like to hear from some folks here around that bigger question for a little bit, and then on which path do we want to take? Do we want to stay with a broader proposal or move to something that's more limited around really looking at electrification of furnaces and looking at electrification of individual systems with a tank? Because I think that will shape some of the smaller questions for this particular group. Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Katrina. That was a good way to frame a way to move forward here. In the context of the Energized Denver, what was identified there, and Grant, first of all, I am recognizing the difference between existing for replacement versus new when you're just going in for the first time. That makes an awful lot of sense. However, the ability to apply heat pump technology for either domestic water heating or space heating is a complete continuum of easy to hard. And it makes perfect sense to perhaps start on the easy end, which is what, and you've identified that it is indeed the more packaged type of equipment. It's the places where you can just install a cataloged tank type water heater where you can just use VRF type equipment. And heck, VRF equipment, I would make the argument that, VRF equipment's doing good work down to, the negative numbers. So that's what I say. On one hand, some of these things are easy. Applying heat pump technology to 20 degrees in multifamily is like medium easy. I am encouraging that path of trying to identify where this could be easily applied first in this 2023 code, and then let's increment it as the codes and the technologies catch up.
Thanks, Mark. Darren?
Yeah, I was going to say something kind of similar. I think that there is some benefit to aligning with Energize on the sort of small package. I mean, number one, it just kind of creates general clarity right amongst the industry. But number two, there's some really significant difficulties on the larger central systems, especially when it comes to domestic water, implementing that in an existing building. If you've got a little boiler room laid out with a natural gas boiler, you're not putting a central heat pump system in there, which kind of cracks a whole can of worms, right? And so I like the idea of kind of start with the simple, phase in the more difficult as you go. And not to mention just the whole piece of that technology really is unavailable on the market and certainly not at an effective price point yet. So, yeah.
Thanks. Libby?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is along similar lines, more so around that space heating as a whole is easier and domestic water is the harder piece. And that aligns with, technology availability, space constraints and everything we're seeing. So I'll kind of focus on the space heating one just because I think there's quite a bit to unpack there a little bit more ways that we could frame this. I think our biggest concern with this is that given that it's a mandatory item, it feels very prescriptive. And we want to be told about where we need to be, but not exactly how we need to get there or exactly what we need to do. And so especially if this is a mandatory item that would then apply to buildings seeking performance compliance with an energy model, they're going to be pushed to a certain level of standard anyways. So it's one thing to say you can't use gas as your space heating method, but it's another thing to say you have to use a heat pump that has a capacity down to this temperature, and that it kind of takes away a lot of the flexibility that design teams can utilize in terms of design, equipment selection, cost, ability to use electric resistance with ERVs, available are options to use like a passive house design with electric resistance. So kind of trying to incorporate a little bit more flexibility around the design options of how we get to electrification versus just picking out one.
Thanks, Libby. Is there anyone who wants to speak in favor of continuing to try to work towards electrification, a proposal that would require electrification of all space or water heating systems? We could parse them if you want to discuss them separately, but I'm hearing the group say, yes, let's try to pick the easier systems first, which I think then leads us to maybe look at the proposal that you've started working on, Sean, to look at how we might align with, if we start picking off space heat with Energize Denver today. But is there anyone that wants to make the opposite case? Okay. Libby?
I'm not sure if I'm fully sorry. I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding the question, but I think the easier and harder doesn't necessarily align with systems within space heating and within water heating. In our perspective, it's space heating is easier and water heating is harder, rather than the easier and harder systems, how the way that Energize Denver is separated, especially for new construction, if that makes sense.
Are you arguing that for space heating, all system types should be built electric?
Right, yeah, saying no gas is okay for all space heating system types. Saying exactly how they have to get to no gas is kind of the caveat, I'd say. But I think it's possible for all systems for space heating, not all systems for water heating, though. Does that make sense?
Mark shook his head no.
Yeah,
I would just say, I mean, I think it's for the, if you're kind of 80-20 ruling this, it's very, very possible for the big chunk of it. It's those exceptions when you get into the large makeup air or specialty type things that it's not there yet, right? But
That's an excellent way to put it, Darren, is that the 80-20 rule. And this is possibly where a lot of us, and I'm including me in this too, but when we say something is easy, because we look at the, there is a wide variety of heat pumps that will heat, down to a certain value. There is indeed a wide range of especially the tank type water heaters that are, set up with heat pumps. The question is going to be, all those buildings back there in my background, that's still 20% though. I get that. The vast majority of the market is, packaged equipment that can be done with air source heat pumps, and you're not having to run systems for, several thousand feet within the building, because what that makes people like me need to do is serve that with water-based systems.
Okay.
I just,
No, that sounds good. I think one of the questions I'm hearing that we'll need to resolve is what counts as easy. So Sean, I don't know if you want to walk us through what's a very early version of what you'd been thinking about to try to start to parse space heating in this way. And with that, I might just note some things that I know need more refining, if that's all right, Sean, from what we've heard from the code committee, while you're pulling that up.
Yeah,
And
Katrina,
then we can,
Darren's
sorry, go ahead,
had his
Darren.
hand up a little bit. Darren's
Oh,
had
I
his-
thought it was an old hand, Darren. Go ahead if you, I hadn't seen it ever go down after you last commented, but go ahead.
no, I
Was it
think
old hand
I
or
think
new
that's
one?
old. Thank you though.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Is that good? I don't want to assume. There's a few things that I think we'd heard before that we know we need to work on regarding space heat. So now we're hearing, I'm going to start to build a list that will go into our future agendas and things we will work on between now and your next meeting, right? So the first is we need to parse more of sort of what counts as easy. And we can look at how Sean is starting to think about how we might define that. I think we're going to need to really refine some of the exceptions around like where the capacity cutoffs happen. And around air recovery systems. So there's just some specific details, but maybe you can even point some of those out, Sean, as you walk through this.
Sure. So one of the things about the Electrify Denver approach is that since it is, instead of mandating heat pumps, it's prohibitory instead. So that actually gets rid of some of the issues that the other proposal faced and then adds different ones. So we'll start with, I've highlighted here kind of the language from Electrify Denver that applies for what is going to be going into effect in 2024. Keep in mind, this isn't code language. This is the ordinance directing code language that does this to be adopted. And it really is about gas-fired warm air furnaces. And so this one is located outside of the building thermal envelope. So this is talking about rooftop units fundamentally. And if we're to replicate that in new construction, so it is rough. This is just, we're just beginning to put this together. Located. It does it the same way.
Energized Denver covers both inside the envelope and outside the envelope in 2025 for furnaces. So go ahead. The language you pulled there is only for the outside, but there's a second clause.
There's
for
a separate,
inside.
okay. So
Hey, I'm so sorry to interrupt, Sean. Katrina, I was going to ask if could you provide a link to the latest Energized Denver language? I've been looking for it on the website and I'm not putting my fingers on it.
Yes, well, right now in the chat.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
All right. Let me get back to it really quick. So this goes with the same prohibition approach that we see in the Electrify Denver. And so it would prohibit gas-fired warm air furnaces from being installed in new buildings, recognizing that the language for this is going to need to be written differently for the existing buildings when the Energize Denver is implemented. It pretty much just prohibits their installation except as supplementary heat. And then we see something that's very similar to the other proposal. I would say that there was an issue in the other proposal with supplementary heat. It is a term that is used in the code right now. And so in some senses, it's an established term. However, when we begin to use it more intensively, which is what we're suggesting to do here, there may be a need to formally define it in a more specific way. And I think that that need under a system like this, where it's prohibitory, I think probably it intensifies that need. So when we're looking at implementing the Energize Denver approach, we'll call it the Energize Denver approach, we might need to define what supplementary heat is, supplementary equipment, since it's going to probably show up on both space heating and water heating equipment. It might need to be defined in a way that works for either, and then might need to be worked for electric resistance as well as gas fired. So I just wanted to highlight that issue, that I think that should be on our radar. So I guess we can start with any questions or just jump right into, discussion of the concept.
Yeah, I guess I have a question is, I like the way that it simplifies, sort of like you said earlier, to sort of just say don't use gas. But are you inadvertently, by limiting this to warm air furnaces, just steering towards people doing natural gas boiler systems in that sort of medium size?
It could potentially do that. And so I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah,
I always wonder.
Oh, sorry. I thought, Sean, you thought about maybe getting at this through a capacity limit so that it was there's a heating capacity under which it's more often these sort of package units versus a more custom.
We could certainly do it that way. So this initial draft was drafted to align fully with 2025 requirements from Energize Denver. Keeping in mind in 2027, there are going to start to be requirements for central boilers as well. They're different, they're not quite as aggressive as this, but Energize Denver does have some requirements for boilers farther down the line.
I want to give others a chance to speak because I know we've heard a lot from Mark and Libby. Are there thoughts from especially some of our other mechanical engineers who joined us, or I think Eric, you bring expertise building all electric for Boulder Housing Authority and working with them on these sorts of projects. And even if it's not exactly on topic, some of what we're trying to do is sort out what are our future meeting agendas. So if it's not exactly to this, I think it would still be nice to hear from some others. And then I'll go back to Mark and Libby. That's okay if not. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Eric Johnson up in Boulder. We have had better success with split systems, heat pumps for space heating than for water heating. We have used heat pump water heaters on one large project, and there have been operational issues as we put that project into operation, having to do with noise inside the units and a stream of cold air coming out of those units as they extract heat out of the ambient air. So those are just a couple of the experiential challenges we've had with heat pump water heaters. Space heating, on the other hand, has gone very well with multiple split systems on our multifamily projects.
Thank you. And I see Mike Fulton has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, seems like earlier, mandating that it has to be heat pumps versus, if someone wanted to do solar or, some other new technology. I think driving the outcome is what you want. And, if you say, hey, we're going to get rid of gas, just get rid of gas. Don't say gas fired warmer furnace. Just two thoughts.
Thank you. Mike Reynolds.
Yeah, just on the electric water heater front, the instantaneous or the tankless water heaters were brought up earlier. Has that come up in consideration for an option as an electric option for unit water heating? And basically, considering that for language within the proposal?
So right now, this one is space heating. It sounds like we probably need to get to the discussion of water heating pretty quickly. And we can talk about that when we talk about water heating.
Got it. So to comment on that, I think that now I'm a mechanical engineer, so I'm trying to track along with some of this discussion, but I think the exception for supplementary heat being able to use gas for supplementary heat, a DOAS system comes to mind. So direct outside air provides fresh air into the units, and I think that your gas exception would allow that to continue to be powered by gas. Is my understanding correct?
I believe that it would, but I think that this is one of those reasons. This raises that supplementary heat may need better definition if we're going to be putting more pressure on what supplementary heat is. Sometimes the code is like that. Everyone agrees on what it means until it matters what it means.
Yeah. The one other question while I'm chatting here is, help me understand how these would relate to the energy model that is currently being used. Is it big multifamily building? As long as we're putting in heat pumps for space heating and electric water heaters, we satisfy the energy code, or how does that tie into one another? Because that's the big roadblock I've hit on my current project, is the energy model shoots us down from trying to electrify, but there's really nothing we can do about it.
We have another working group that is working through the issues of modeling, and one of those issues is how to encourage electric equipment within the modeling methodologies. So there is a proposal to help with that, that would make it so that move from energy cost to site energy as the metric in modeling, which would go a long way to removing those modeling barriers to using electric equipment.
Yeah.
Katrina, should we switch over to the water heating version of this, since it sounds like people like discussing water heating?
Yeah, let's spend a moment on water heating, and then I want to, and then I'll turn back to you, Mark, and others, let's try to spend then, if you're brief, Sean, the remaining time just flagging thoughts and concerns that need to be addressed. A few of you have sent us some of those things in writing. Know that we have those cataloged, and we want to bring a draft back that addresses all of those concerns, but we needed to make some directional decisions and get some directional input from this group first. So go ahead, Sean.
All right, so this one is similar. Again, down below, I've highlighted the language from Energize Denver, and it really talks about two things. So it says when a storage water heater or instantaneous water heater is proposed to be replaced, it needs to be electric. And then there's a further requirement that if it's electric resistance, the electric resistance would need to be supplied by on-site renewable energy. So that's what we're seeing from Energize Denver. And if we look at how we could implement that in language for new construction, we can say fossil fuel and electric resistance, instantaneous and storage water heating equipment shall not be used to provide service hot water in new buildings. And then we have some exceptions. One is this electric resistance, where there's 100% on-site renewable energy. This is similar to what we already see for the high input service water heating requirement that's in the commercial code. You can get that one of the exceptions to the high efficiency requirement for those boilers is that you have a certain amount of on-site renewable energy. And then again, we have this supplementary water heating in accordance with this other new section. And that has a very similar setup, that it's, can only be operated in certain circumstances. This would allow gas backup, but we are talking about only being limited to storage and instantaneous water heaters, not boilers with this requirement. So backup may not really be essential or important, but it might. So we at least have the allowance and we have the alignment with the ordinance.
As we're talking about how to align with the Energize Denver ordinance, can you all touch on when Energize Denver ordinance is put into effect and implemented, how will the feasibility reporting and some of the cost reporting go into whether things are actually going to be mandated? And I think about, all the individual hot water heaters that would either need to be changed out to heat pumps or electric and solar added. And when that's just not feasible, physically not feasible, how that's going to be dealt with and how you see that relating to potentially attempting to mandate that for new construction.
Yeah, that's a great question, Elizabeth. So we're developing the processes for how that will work right now, but for a water heater replacement, it's going to be very simple because there's just a few criteria, like does it work to electrify the water heater in your existing building or not? Do you have the electrical capacity? Do you have somewhere to vent the cold air? And so there'll be some pretty simple things that if they don't exist, they would be very expensive to fix. And so there will be an exception that's simple for simple systems. Where a system is more complicated, the exceptions are going to get, and the feasibility reports are going to get more complicated, right? And so I think I'd like to hear from the group thoughts on this question, because I think in new buildings, well, you could install the electrical capacity and have a place to vent the cold air. Some of those questions seem more solvable, but I'd love to hear from others sort of what you think of that question. So let's go through and anything else that folks want to add in terms of kind of what we need to be considering. And then we will pull that together into more structure in the next meeting, probably diving deep on a specific topic. So this is our general framing meeting. So we'll go down the list in the order hands were raised. So Mark Jelinski, go ahead.
All right, thank you. First of all, I'd like us to just remember to keep in mind what good a heat pump water heater actually does, especially for the one that everyone's probably thinking of most of the time, the tank type water heater that is located in the conditioned space. One of the issues that was brought up as far as real world issues is noise, but also what was maybe expressed as just a nuisance of some cold air breezes. What that means is the way these things work is they suck heat out of the conditioned space, add the kW that's being used to drive the compressor, and that's the amount of BTUs that go to the water. So it's essentially, it's not essentially, it is stealing space heat and then just adding essentially resistance heat to the space. So I have always struggled with what does a heat pump water heater really get us, except for a nice little pat on the back. It's not unless you've actually absorbed heat from somewhere else, like the outdoors. And of course, there's multiple challenges in doing that, not the least of which is it will get cold. And therefore, not only do the units start to not work under 40 degrees, but the water starts to freeze under 40 degrees.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to move to the next person just because we have 3 more hands in 3 minutes. But Danny, let's go with you.
So I was just getting hung up on a definition of replaced and new systems on existing buildings, because we can have an existing building with a tenant finish that totally guts the previous tenant's equipment. And so would any new water heater that's introduced to this new tenant be considered a replacement, or would it be considered a new system?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we need to look at. I think there's references in code. Energized Denver covers replacements. So when something is a major renovation, which I think is more what you're referring to, but we'll need to define that, then that would fall to this code proposal. Let's see, Chuck, your hand was up next. Other issues, yeah. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. No, with both proposals, just the idea of availability of equipment, cost, the additional cost, like is there a substantiation or analysis how these electrifying buildings across the different building types have been done? Like New York limited their electrification proposal to 7 stories, obviously to handle some of the larger central systems. And I was just curious, has there been any legwork or similar work to identify some of the guardrails of this and just some of the limits of the availability of equipment and what the limits are? Like I know a lot of the larger systems for heat pump water heating have the remote condensers, and from what I read is that it seems like 40 degrees is the limit unless you use a different refrigerant. And it seems like there's only like Colmac in Washington uses CO2, which can go to a lower temperature. Just understanding and seeing the detailed substantiation behind what's being proposed and why we're getting to these numbers, I think would greatly help this committee, but also the IECC code committee when they hear this, to understand that it's been well vetted and understood where these numbers came from across the board.
Thanks, Chuck. I think that's right, and that's we have NBI that can help us do some of that research to the extent that it's available and out there. So we've done a lit review of the studies that are available locally, but I think there might be more national learnings we could draw from too. So thank you. Darren, you'll get the final word, and then I promise everyone, if some of you need to start hopping, I know we're at the top of the hour, we will send out notes. We will structure a next agenda based on sort of all of what we're hearing here. Feel free to send me more thoughts offline or Courtney, and we'll pull that in to what we bring back to the group, because I know this is a large group. It's hard to fit in everyone's comments. So do feel free to, just type even as we're in these meetings and send them offline to us. Go ahead, Chuck.
One last thing was
sorry, I meant to go to Danny, but go ahead. Yeah, if you have something else.
Well, my last point was just that the fact that modeling currently doesn't apply because gas is used as a baseline, and modeling is typically as a cost analysis. So just understanding how much more it is going to cost building owners to operate buildings with the electric would be beneficial to some substantiation. So when the committee's voting on this, they understand, is there an additional cost that the building owner, the tenant, the resident will have to incur with these systems? Just understanding what that additional cost is would be beneficial.
Great. And I think Danny put his hand down. Perhaps he had to hop off. Again, thank you all so much for your time to kick off this discussion. Do feel free to send us more thoughts if you have them offline, and we'll be working to prep for your next meeting. Thank you, everyone. If anyone wants to stay on, we're happy to stay and chat for a minute, but we can let everyone go.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
We have folks that wanted to chat a bit more who are still here.
Looks like Mark may be the only non-city or NDI.
I guess.
Yeah.
And I did want to thank you, and you got to Elmo me, just let me know when it's time to move on, and I'll try to keep that in mind. So I don't take that personally at all. I get it. It's a big thing. So, and you've also been seeing my comments via email, so I can certainly stick with that. And based on that, since many of you have seen some of those, I guess I'm just going to highly encourage, let's try to limit this to the practical ethers. And this is the question, I'm not sure how to put this in code. Practical sizes, practical building types, that sort of thing. And it's my overall, I've expressed this before too, my overall thought is that I'm just thinking that calibrating C406 to allow for the flexibility and the innovation that smart guys can come up with is possibly the better way to go rather than a technology mandate. And
we're already doing that.
I know that.
So
But
I
I
meant
mean,
to mention that at the beginning, but that's done. And that will be calibrated depending on where this conversation lands. But so this is in addition to having lots of
No,
points.
I understand that. And I guess if my overall comment is that I would prefer that it not be in addition to, that it be not there at all, that I need to, I'm going to have needs to provide gas furnaces just right there. A common occurrence is in a healthcare environment where, but it's also supposed to be, relatively cost effective. The answer is packaged gas-fired DX cooling equipment. That equipment is very available in heat pump and gas furnaces, or even heat pump and electric. The issue is that I need to provide emergency power for that during power losses for heating, and provide it. We never provide enough amps to provide the cooling. And the way the heat pumps work, it's about the same amount of amps to provide heating as it is cooling. So the issue is that we need to have the flexibility to provide a gas-fired unit that can then be backed up by a reasonable size generator without now I don't mind at all having to pull out the stops because it's not an all electric building. I get that, and that's why it's kind of cool to have that C406. It says here's an electric building. If it's all electric, it's easy. If it's not all electric, it's hard. Okay, that's what they pay me for. But just starting off right off the top saying I can't even use gas furnaces is problematic in many cases. Another one I think I've mentioned is there's still plenty of places that only need heating, the heating only type of applications. When you put in a heat pump, it's a cooling unit. You've just mandated cooling for that space. So, and just this is what I'd like to work through. I think that the path that was mentioned about limiting these, it shall be a heat pump, that's one way to do it. And I can support that. I'll help you work through that to come up with some practical answers. But my overall recommendation is to just let us deal with C406 and modeling. That's the other big thing that'll help us, is get it to the point where it's not a cost thing on modeling.
Thank you, Mark. We do need to keep going, and I understand that's your perspective. It's not the question before this group, so I would ask that that's something that the committee is moving forward, is the C406. It's a separate working group, so let's just talk about that there.
I'll try to do that from now on. That's why I left it there.
If we were to require something, what would make sense? So let's stick to that in this group. You may not agree with the outcome, but if you'd like to participate in shaping what it is, then it would be great to have.
And I will do that with that in mind. Thank you for
should the
setting
committee
the
decide to move forward with it. Great. Thank you. Chuck, did you have other things you wanted to share?
The only last thing I was going to mention was, by mandating heat pumps, we're going to pretty much eliminate moving water around the building for